Shalom and welcome to Jerusalem Studio. Earlier this week, U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff Chairman C.Q. Brown voiced concern that Israel would be drawn into a full-scale war with Hezbollah. General Brown said that he fears that in case Israel's offensive threatens the survivability of the Iranian proxy, Tehran would join the fight in order to save its most potent Lebanese arm from annihilation. The inevitable conclusion is that Iran prefers saving its regional tentacles for a time of its own choosing, but should one of them be threatened with extinction, it will jump into the fray at the cost of making its homeland another battleground. Is that a realistic scenario? And what would then happen to the executors of Iranian anti-Israel policy in Syria and Iraq, Yemen and the west of the Jordan River? Joining us to analyze it from the United States is Professor Russell Berman, who is the director of the Middle East and Islamic World Working Group at Hoover Institution at Stanford University, who formerly served as senior advisor at the policy planning staff at the U.S. State Department. It's good to see you, Russell.
Good to see you, Jonathan.
Also joining us from Central Israel is Mr. Ori Saschal, who is the head of the research department at the Israel Defense and Security Forum. Shalom, Ol.
Good to be with you, Jonathan.
And let's now turn here to our TV7 editor-at-large, Mr. Amir Oren. Amir, take it away.
So the Islamic Republic of Iran has apparently decided to follow the biblical dictum of go forth and multiply on two dimensions. First, they are part of the anti-Western, anti-Israel, one may say, grouping of China, Russia, and North Korea. But this is less important for our discussion. What is more germane is that there is the so-called ring of fire in which Israel has to contend with several Iranian proxies and arms. The Houthis, Hamas, Hezbollah, and the pro-Iranian Iraqi militias, probably those working out of Syria, those trying to undermine the Jordanian regime, and in Judea and Samaria also there are Palestinian groups being sponsored and encouraged by Tehran. Now, as for what you quoted from Chairman Brown, it seems as if the Biden administration is trying to walk a very delicate line and has a unique traffic light. It says to Israel, listen, you have a red light from us. We are not going to encourage you to invade Lebanon. At the same time, they are showing the Lebanese or Hezbollah and the Iranians a sort of a green light for Israel. They say, listen, the Israelis may very well decide that they've had it enough and they will attack Hezbollah and we will do nothing to stop them. So whether this double message can really get through or not remains to be seen. But the fact is, Israel is facing a multi-sector Iranian front.
Indeed. Well, Professor Berman, mixed signals coming out of Washington. What can we take out of it? And what is the concrete policy right now of the Biden administration when it comes to this multi-front war?
Well, I'm the wrong person to ask about a concrete policy from the Biden administration. It's not clear to me that they have a concrete policy. They're driven by multiple factors. Foremost, of course, is the election. President Biden does not want to have a increased instability in the world in the lead up to the election because of his anxiety, his misplaced anxiety, I believe, about the Arab American vote. I can comment on that a little bit later. But I think his the messages that are being sent are more likely to increase instability in the region, and he will achieve exactly what he doesn't want to get. Now, add to that electoral concern, a longstanding inclination in the part of the I'll put it the Obama-Biden wing of the Democratic Party appeasement toward Iran. The Democratic Party, or at least that wing, does not see Iran as a negative factor in the region. On the contrary, it wants to appease or indeed strengthen Iran. Hence, it's walking back from the regime of sanctions that the Trump administration had imposed. When the Trump administration left office, Iran was on the verge of bankruptcy because the Biden administration has refused to enforce the sanctions. Tehran has enormous cash reserves now, and with those cash reserves, it can fund Hezbollah and its other proxies.
Indeed, we're talking about roughly $800 million a year being smuggled or funneled to the Iranian proxy Hezbollah in Lebanon. But Mr. Issachar, when we're looking at the broad scheme of things, what would be the Iranian interest to have Hezbollah engage Israel in all-out war?
Well, I think Iran is using one of its main proxies, maybe the most nurtured protege of Iran, which is Lebanon's Hezbollah, in a bid to really change and this convergence of forces in the region to turn it back to Iran's favor. And that has been the Iranian regime's objective ever since the Iranian Revolution of 1979. Basically instill Iranian hegemony in the region by means of the Quds Force. Hezbollah is often, I suspect, speaking out of leader Khamenei's mouth. Khamenei is often sending Nasrallah to deliver messages on his behalf, as I suspect happened in the Cyprus case. But I also see something else, that both Israel and Hezbollah are both walking a thin line, but do not have a full operational sovereignty, as Michael Doran put it once. That is to say, Israel would, if necessary, act against Hezbollah in Lebanon, even if it would not be on the behest and pleasure of the United States, the main strategic partner. However, Hezbollah is very unlikely not to act without the behest, on the behest and pleasure of the Iranian regime. So on the that is very interesting because it's not just a bilateral war, but actually a much greater global theater where the United States, in order to put a stop to all the little puddles floating around the region, close the main tap, which is Iran. And I think putting more pressure on the Iranian regime rather than trying to appease it in secret talks in Oman or attempting to resume the Iranian nuclear program, the nuclear deal, I think that would be the wrong course of action right now. Biden administration is a bit speaking on both sides of its mouth, trying to both warn Hezbollah from escalation, warning Israel from going into escalation. And in that sense, I think the region will be better served if Iran gets a firm message from the United States that this whole campaign needs to stop.
Indeed. Mr. Owen?
We have the munitions dimension of the problem. Israel, for many months, and actually even before the Gaza war started, has been warning Hezbollah and the state of Lebanon that should war erupt there, because Hezbollah would initiate it, the result would be making Lebanon go back to the Stone Age, or after October the 8th, a cut and paste sort of campaign in Lebanon. If you look at Gaza, you see the future of Beirut. The Biden administration and much of the international community, as reflected in the two courts in The Hague, do not like it, do not like what they see. Whether they are right or not is irrelevant. And the Biden administration does not want to be blamed for letting Israel bomb Lebanon back to the Stone Age. And therefore, it is broadcasting, or as used to be the cliche, telegraphing. Not many people are using the telegraph anymore, to the world, that it is holding off at least on some of the heavier munitions for the Israel Air Force. Now, this may encourage Hezbollah and Iran to believe that they can withstand.
With that being said, though, those munitions, particularly speaking about the 500 grams and the, I think it was 250 pounders.
Pound, yeah.
Right, the 2,000 pounds. they're earmarked for the Gaza Strip. The arsenals for northern Israel are full with surplus.
You start a war, you don't know what your logistics needs would be. On October the 8th or October 27th, when the ground maneuver started, no one in Israel really believed that come late June, we will still be there. The Air Force is not bombing as much as it did originally. And yes, there are stocks earmarked for the north, but who knows, it may even flare up and go east towards Iran proper. So you can't just rely on what you have at hand or what you are producing in-house, especially because there are certain items such as the SDB, small diameter bomb, or the JDAM, the Joint Direct Action munitions, for which the Americans, Boeing, have proprietary rights. You can't produce it all in Israel.
With that being said, Professor Berman, when we're really looking at the broad scheme of this issue of withholding munitions, or at least delaying their arrival to Israel, it was more about the black tape, not being able to expedite those munitions in a fashion that would bring about deliveries in an expedited manner, as was the case at the beginning of this war. Essentially trying to control the scope of intensity of this war by doing so. Right now, Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant is in Washington, and it seems like things are clearing up, that they may start to once again deliver upon their pledges of standing by Israel during this hour of need. Nonetheless, what signal does it send, not only to the Islamic Republic of Iran, but to China and Russia, which are no little stakeholders when we're talking about strategic power competition in the Middle East?
There are two different dimensions to this. One is the real supplying of munitions. The other is the messaging about it. I think it's pretty clear that the Biden administration has been slow walking the delivery of munitions. Some of that is natural bureaucratic process, but the Biden administration, if it had the will, could overcome that natural bureaucratic process and expedite, as you put it, the delivery of munitions. But then separate from that, there's the communications dimension of this whole war. And the Biden administration seems to be broadcasting the difference between Jerusalem and Washington, broadcasting a reluctance to supply Israel in its hour of need. Of course, at the same time, there's the emphasis on how ironclad the support is, but iron rusts, and it's unclear what the Biden administration would do if such and such circumstance were to develop, what kind of munitions it would just choose not to supply. A lot of that is electoral strategy. At the same time, it sends the message to Hamas: hold on, you don't have to negotiate. You don't have to concede at all, because Washington is going to force Jerusalem to concede. That's not good messaging, let alone the impact of this messaging in Iran and elsewhere. I think the Biden administration is following bad munition strategy and bad communication strategy to the detriment of the national interest of the United States. The end point of the current Biden administration policy, despite its protestations about ironclad support for Israel, is the survival of Hamas in a Palestinian state, which is not good for the United States, even if the Biden administration is stumbling toward that outcome.
Indeed. Well, a couple of days ago, we had Colonel Joel Rayburn on the show, during the course of which he highlighted that if we take, for example, the Strait of Bab el-Mandeb and the utilization of Iran of Ansar Allah, the Houthi-dominated organization there, blocking that strategic waterway, what signal does this send to a country like China that could utilize potentially a proxy to frustrate freedom of navigation in a number of strategic waterways in the east, or Russia, for instance, if we're talking about northern straits? But let's go down within those resolutions and try and figure out something, Mr. Issachar, when we're looking at the Iranian proxies. How emboldened are they when we're talking about their activities right now in light of the double messaging coming out of Washington?
Well, I think the messaging from Washington should be crystal clear. And right now, it seems as if the policy of appeasement that characterized the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal from 2015, basically looking the other way from the threat and brushing the problems under the rug rather than trying to resolve them, has not passed on this particular conflict. The main destabilizing factor in the region is the Islamic Republic of Iran, and it seems as if, much like the Obama administration, the present one, it has been trying to put pressure on the side of Israel and maybe the pragmatic Arab states, Saudi Arabia and others. I think this is precisely the opposite, but I think it's also reflective of the general, I would say, tragedy of Western democracies that have constant election cycles every 2 years, congressional election to Congress, and every 4 years election to the presidency. And in Iran and in the East, it's really not the case, as we see in both Iran, Russia, and China. And I think looking at it is really reflective of the dynamics here. When Israel is thinking 10 hours forward, we call it strategy. Iran thinks 1,000 years forward, and they're willing to take the time and even compromise on the way. And trying to sort of mitigate it with temporary agreements would be as if trying to stop, a moving train with a gun. I think it would be to the detriment of a useful Middle East strategy not to see the forces that are at play here, are not hesitant to show force. And I think Israel has been trying to deal with that force through the campaign between the wars, sort of foiling activities here and there, but then avoiding an all-out war, and that only invited an all-out war. Initiative actions like such as the one we had against the Iraqi and Syrian reactors have become more and more obsolete over the past few years, until the Iranian system, forced Israel's hand into action. And I think the main lesson here is not to wait for the other side to initiate, but to force its hand through stringent mechanisms, but also regional coalitions led by the United States, with the participation of Israel and pragmatic Arab countries, strong sanctions, and incredible military threat. I think this is the language to speak in the Middle East against Iran, rather than appeasement attempts and trying to reach a deal that it's clear that both Iran and Hezbollah will violate.
When Israeli defense planners looked at the threat emanating from Tehran, they usually saw the Iranian nuclear problem as strategic, Hezbollah's vast missile arsenal as operational, and Hamas as only tactical. But for the last almost 9 months, it has been upended. The Gaza war is a strategic problem from Israel because it cannot extricate itself from it for various reasons, even if it does announce soon that the current campaign or the current phase is over. So from that point of view, in that regard, it's a plus for Iran because it can go ahead with its nuclear program, while Israel is still involved, first of all, with Hamas, and secondly, with Hezbollah, rather than with the biggest problem of all down the line, the Iranian nuclear warhead or warheads.
With that being said, when we're talking about the Gaza Strip as a strategic problem, it has a strategic dimension to it, but there are tactical applications that can deal with this strategic issue for the short to medium term, including long-term.
But the definition of a strategic is really what concerns the decision maker. It is not necessarily what is happening in the battlefield. And as long as the Israeli government has no real answer to the thousands upon thousands of Israelis who are displaced, dislocated, this is strategic.
Indeed. Well, nonetheless, it is part of a grand strategy, which has to contend with the Islamic Republic of Iran. And this is something that also during your last couple of productions of Powers in Play, which you hosted here, and we had here also Dr. Uzi Arad, formerly an Israeli national security advisor, he did raise a question. What would happen if the Islamic Republic, absent intelligence or raw intelligence on the capacity to truly identify all of the various legs that the Iranians have in order to establish a certain breakthrough towards a nuclear payload, could potentially test such a nuclear weapon in the near to medium term future before the election or in between November and January, before the next elected president will take his seat. Professor Berman, is that a scenario that you see as likely? And if so, how can the West at large and the United States and Israel in particular contend with such a scenario?
Whether Tehran decides to display that it has passed the nuclear threshold capacity before the election, in between the election and the inauguration, after the inauguration, I don't give free advice to Tehran. I think that would clearly be a significant game changer. I want to emphasize, though, that obviously Israel faces multi-pronged challenges coming out of Tehran. Part of it is nuclear, part of it is Hezbollah, part of it is Hamas. As I follow the Israeli press, I think there's a danger in somehow diminishing the importance of defeating Hamas. The real strategic alternative to Iranian nuclear capacity was the politics of the Abraham Accords, developing a counter-Iran alliance in the region. If Israel can't defeat Hamas, its value as a partner in Abraham Accords disappears. Israel as a valuable partner for Saudi Arabia depends on its capacity to defeat Hamas. Therefore, I think it's absolutely right for Israel to be proceeding against Hamas vigorously, despite the fact that, of course, it's not the only challenge that Israel faces.
Mr. Yisachar, peace through strength was the underlying motto for the Abraham Accords. And as Professor Berman says, if we are regarded or perceived as weak against Hamas, which is merely a small terror organization that someone is supposed to contend with the might of the Israeli military, why would anyone want to make peace with Israel, let alone the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, which is trying to evaluate its, basically hedging its bets and evaluate its current state of play in a very challenging dynamic where the Islamic Republic is seemingly outmaneuvering the West.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Actually, if Israel fails to reach victory, which means reaching its objectives in Gaza, defeating Hamas, bringing back all the hostages, and ushering in a new reality in Gaza, that would actually greenlight the rest of the Iranian axis and the radical axis and the system basically built in the Middle East to attack. And the pragmatic Arab countries led by Saudi Arabia understand that. They understand that the nature of the real threat in the Middle East and the main destabilizing factor in the Middle East is not Israel, it's Iran. We saw the leaked videos from the Munich Security Council, the Munich Security Conference, where the foreign ministers of Arab countries were going out of the way in order to express their concern about Iran and how clear and present danger it poses to them. But it dials back to your earlier point of Iran's nuclear program and its proliferation of terrorism, its radical view for the region, who are actually terrorizing Arab states, have created the ground, actually ushered in the conditions at the basis of the Abraham Accords. I think Arab countries' main national interest remained permanent, which is preserving their own regimes. I think that just the means to reach that objective has gone through transformation, not alienating Israel, but actually coming closer to Israel, not looking at Israel as a pariah, but a partner. And in that respect, I think, and I heard it from senior Israeli officials, that actually had October 7 not taken place, we would already have seen Israeli-Saudi normalization. We see it all over the place in the September United Nations General Assembly, where it seems very clear that Israeli-Saudi normalization is imminent. And so pragmatic Arab countries understand they need to get closer to Israel. That's in many ways, it's a gateway to Washington, and they need that kind of stability also for their regime. And Israel needs to see the entire campaign. I don't see just a Gaza theater, although it's the war theater with the highest military intensity. I can see an entire puzzle where Iran is actually the puppet master, you can call it, activating its many proxies in the region. And in this campaign, this Iranian front has to be dealt with by the entire responsible actors in the region.
Absolutely. Mr. Owen, this is the last edition for this broadcast season, and therefore think very carefully about what you're about to say.
Maybe I'll first say it and then think about what I said and have time to regret it. What we, as watchers of other people's business can say, and what other people watching us can say, is important, but nevertheless, there is this nexus of national security and domestic politics. And therefore, it is not governments or analysts who really give the people their solutions. It's the public and the way it impacts on the politicians.
Indeed. Public fortitude during times of war is vital. And this is all the time that we have for today. I'd like to thank Mr. Issachar, Professor Berman, and Mr. Owen, of course. I'd like to thank all of you at home as well. Until our next edition from here in Jerusalem. Shalom.
My name is Eran Lerman. I used to be Deputy National Security Advisor to the Government of Israel. Currently Vice President of the Jerusalem Institute for Strategy and Security, a think tank, and the editor of the Jerusalem Strategic Tribune. For the last few years, I've been a regular panelist for TV7, a fantastic opportunity to bring deep and analytical perspectives to the debate over regional affairs, Israeli affairs, international affairs, in the company of some of the best minds in Israel.